China's massive expansion in Vietnam and Mexico is a backdoor to bypass US sanctions, worries China to build 3 electric car factories in Mexico. An impending wave of Chinese investment in Mexico has alarmed Washington, as 3 of China's largest electric car manufacturers prepare to build factories south of the US border. Milligram, BYD, and Chery have spoken with officials in Mexico to find sites this year, according to several people familiar with the talks, and one person said another Chinese company plans to build a $12 billion battery plant. The investment boost could give China's producers a foothold in the region, and shape Latin America's second-largest economy amid the US-China trade war. 3 people familiar with the matter said US officials raised questions about Chinese investments more broadly in meetings with their Mexican counterparts, and Mexican officials acknowledged they should be cautious about considering Chinese investments because of the risk of angering the United States, 7th globally. Mexico is the world's 7th largest automobile producer, and one of the countries best to take advantage of disruptions in global supply chains caused by disruptions in the coronavirus pandemic and the US-China trade war, providing cheaper labor, an extensive supply chain, and access to the North American Free Trade Agreement, USMCA. Francisco Bautista of EY Latin America, which works with 4 Chinese electric vehicle companies, said Chinese companies' interest in the Mexican market has grown exponentially. The United States is competing with China for superiority in electric vehicle manufacturing, and has launched strict restrictions to exclude electric cars, batteries, components, and other resources made by Chinese companies from their supply chain through the Inflation Reduction Act. US President Joe Biden's administration is concerned that Chinese automakers will be able to avoid measures by manufacturing cars in Mexico, outperforming global competitors with technologically advanced models at more competitive prices. Senior members of the Republican-led House Select Committee on China wrote in a recent letter that they were concerned that Chinese companies would use Mexico as a backdoor in their market. China is the world's largest producer of electric vehicles and batteries, with automakers increasingly exporting low-cost models around the world as they face spare capacity at domestic factories. MJ, owned by state car giant SAIC, plans to build a plant worth between $1.5 billion and $2 billion in Mexico, while BYD is working to invest hundreds of millions worth of a plant in its first phase, a source familiar with the talks said. A former government official said BYD met last month with ministers from at least 4 Mexican states, including Idamex and Yucatan, at a reception in Mexico City about an electric car plant. The governor of Nuevo León said BYD planned to set up a plant there, although the company said no final decision had been made. SAIC, BYD, and Chery did not respond to requests for comment. Chinese automakers have seen astronomical growth in Mexico in recent years, accounting for nearly a fifth of sales, up from almost 6 years ago. The United States has said it is not trying to block Chinese investment in Mexico. But Janet Yellen, the U.S. Treasury Secretary, recently stressed the need to properly enforce trade rules, including the recent U.S. agreement with Mexico to strengthen foreign investment screening. Mexico relies heavily on the United States, where more than 2/3 of its exports go. 37 million people of Mexican descent live and work, sending nearly $60 billion a year in remittances. When asked whether the investment inspection agreement could harm trade relations between Mexico and China, Finance Minister Rogelio Ramírez de la O was explicit. Sitting next to Yellen in the National Palace, he said, "Our trade and financial relationship with the United States is completely dominant. It is not a big priority to allocate time to countries other than the United States." This year, Mexico became the largest trading partner of the United States, as Biden pushed for greater economic integration in North America, especially in green industries. Mexico is covered by the consumer tax credit provided by the IRA to accelerate the deployment of electric vehicles. But that requires manufacturing models in North America, and sourcing materials and components from countries that have free trade agreements with the United States. No parts could come from China or other foreign entities of concern, adding to U.S. trade barriers that have already dissuaded some new Chinese brands from focusing on the market. Michael Dunn, chief executive of Dunn Insights, an Asia-focused auto consultancy, said Chinese companies are realistic, That anti-China sentiment in Washington threatens to block access to the Biden administration's generous subsidies for electric vehicles. Don said it was clear to them that there was a target on their chests. Vietnam and Mexico. China's the back doors to bypass U.S. sanctions. Few countries in the world play an important economic role because they are back doors, through which the restrictions imposed by the tense relations between Western countries, especially the United States on the one hand, and China on the other, can be bypassed. In light of the escalating geopolitical conflict against the backdrop of the Ukrainian war, and the consequent sharp polarization between world powers, fueled by wars raging in several regions. These countries chose to become an economic meeting point between the conflicting countries, either by circumventing certain sanctions so that they become a refuge used by the sanctioned countries as a haven to escape these sanctions, establishing factories on their territory, or facilitating the trade and investments of these countries, bypassing these sanctions, by exploiting their strategic location. In fact, the US and Chinese economies need each other and cannot disengage from each other even if each side applies sanctions to the other, or protective tariffs are imposed on some goods flowing between them, because the link still exists through some countries that act as a backdoor, including Vietnam and Mexico. China's $18 trillion economy is suffering from contraction in manufacturing activities and declining export growth, as well as a buildup of domestic debt, as the United States has cut off supplies of semiconductors and other technologies that boost China's economic growth. China is also facing a crisis in the real estate market and the decline in the volume of consumer spending, as well as the decline in global demand for Chinese goods in the wake of the corona epidemic, noting that all of this prompted Chinese companies to search for a way out to ensure the continued flow of goods they produce to the US market. So they began to establish factories in countries with good trade relations with the United States, including trade exchange agreements and customs exemptions, which mainly applies to Vietnam and Mexico. The volume of trade exchange between the United States and China is about $690 billion, of which $536 billion are Chinese exports, compared to $153 billion in US exports, which makes China record a huge trade surplus, while the US side records a deficit of $283 billion. Following the exchange of economic sanctions between the United States and China, American companies have moved their factories and activities to countries that are economically integrated with China, such as Vietnam, and China has also pumped investments and established factories in Mexico to circumvent direct sanctions. Vietnam is the 8th largest trading partner of the United States, with sales of $139 billion, as U.S. investment has boomed under the open market economy that the country has pursued in recent years. On the other hand, the more U.S. sanctions on China intensify, the more Beijing increases the size of its projects in Vietnam, with which it shares common borders by land and sea, as economic and trade cooperation between the two sides has maintained good momentum for a long time, while China launched, starting in June 2022, about 3,372 projects in Vietnam, with a total investment of $22.31 billion. Continuation despite sanctions. While the United States accounts for a third of Vietnam's exports, China is Vietnam's largest supplier of raw materials, of equipment and raw materials, thus serving as a link between the United States and China, which means that trade relations between the two countries continue, albeit indirectly. Vietnam formally upgraded relations with the United States in September to a comprehensive strategic partnership, a diplomatic status previously reserved for a select few, including China and India. Despite political tensions between the United States and China, trade ties are getting stronger. After the imposition of U.S. economic sanctions on China, Chinese companies circumvented this decision by setting up factories in Mexico that allow them to classify their goods as made in Mexico. Products and goods that come out of these factories are transported in direct trucks to the United States with full duty-free, as Chinese companies benefit from expanded trade exemptions and facilities between North American countries, which explains why dozens of major Chinese companies are investing heavily in Mexico. According to the U.S. Department of Commerce, about 650 Chinese economic entities are under U.S. sanctions, and another 115 entities have been added since Joe Biden took office. How did the war begin? The trade war between the United States and China began when former President Donald Trump announced in 2018 the imposition of tariffs worth $50 billion on Chinese imports under the U.S. Trade Act of 1974, which combats unfair trade practices and intellectual property thefts, while Beijing in retaliation imposed tariffs on more than 128 American products, the most famous of which is soybeans. China's foreign minister has called on U.S. President Joe Biden's administration to lift Trump's restrictions on Chinese imports, but the calls have so far not been echoed. China's economic growth in 2023 is expected to slow to 5.1%, lower than the previous forecast of 5.2% and closer to the government's forecast of 5%. If you like Today Now channel videos, please like, subscribe, share. Leave us your opinion and point of view in the comments and turn on notifications. Stay tuned for more our interesting subjects.